In the bitter, windswept spring of 2003, 26-year-old Tessa Bridges stood at the edge of a dead wheat field in southern Saskatchewan, watching the topsoil of her father's farm lift off the ground and disappear into a pale gray sky. She had inherited 800 acres of the flattest, driest, most stubborn and productive land in the municipality of Beguif. She had inherited the sagging clapboard farmhouse with its cracked foundation and a kitchen tap that groaned before it gave water. She had inherited a 1986 Case IH tractor that burned oil and leaked hydraulic fluid in equal measure. And she had inherited a debt to the Farm Credit Corporation that sat on the land like a stone on a grave, but tucked into a cardboard box in the upstairs closet beneath a wool blanket that still carried the faint smell of pipe tobacco. She had also inherited her father's notebooks. Ian Bridges had not been a man of many words. He was a quiet, deliberate person who farmed the way he lived, carefully and without spectacle. He had kept these notebooks for over 20 years, not as ledgers of profit and loss, but as a kind of ongoing conversation with the land itself. He recorded rainfall down to the millimeter. He sketched the root patterns of wheat and canola. He noted the dates when the meadowlarks returned each spring, which sloughs held water into July, and which ones dried up by June. And on one page, dated March of 1998, 5 years before the cancer took him, he had written something that stopped Tessa cold the first time she read it. We drained the water to make more land, but maybe we just made more dirt. Her grandfather, Tessa's father's father, had been part of a generation that saw the prairie sloughs as obstacles. Those shallow, marshy depressions that dotted the Saskatchewan landscape like thumbprints in dough were, to men like him, wasted acreage, good land hiding under bad water. So through the 1960s and 70s, he and every other farmer in the district had systematically drained them. They dug ditches, installed culverts, and channeled the water off their property and into the municipal drainage system, where there had once been dozens of small wetlands teeming with ducks, frogs, and cattails. There were now flat, dry rectangles of cropland, indistinguishable from the fields around them. It had seemed like progress. More acres meant more crop meant more money. The logic was unassailable. Except it wasn't. The drained slough bottoms, robbed of their natural moisture cycle, became salt flats within a decade. The white crust of salinization crept outward from the old slough beds like a slow disease, poisoning the soil around it. The water table, no longer recharged by the sloughs, dropped. Wells went deeper. The topsoil, without the natural windbreaks of cattail and willow that had once surrounded each slough, began to blow. By the time Tessa's father took over the farm in the 1980s, he was fighting a losing battle against salt, wind, and exhaustion. He never blamed his own father. That wasn't his way. But he studied the problem with the patience of a man who believed that understanding was a form of respect. He walked the old slough beds, now barren white patches in his fields, and he knelt down and touched the crusted earth. He drove out to the few remaining undrained sloughs on crown land east of the farm and sat on the tailgate of his truck, watching the water, the birds, the thick green margins of sedge and willow. Tessa, as a girl of 12 or 13, sometimes went with him. She didn't understand why her father preferred watching a slough to watching television, but she liked being near him, liked the way he'd point things out without explaining them, trusting her to see. "Look at that, Tess," he'd say, nodding toward the dark soil at the edge of a living slough. It was black and crumbly, rich as cake. Then he'd wave his hand back toward their own fields, visible in the distance, the pale, tired ground barely holding the stubble from last year's mediocre crop. "Now look at ours." He never finished the thought. He didn't need to. The comparison was a sentence that wrote itself. He knew what the land was missing. He had mapped it in his notebooks, circled the old slough locations on an aerial photograph, drawn arrows showing where water had once flowed and pooled before his father sent it all away. But he lacked the money and, perhaps, the nerve. Undoing what your father built is a heavy thing, even when you know it needs undoing. The bank wanted yields, not experiments. The neighbors would have thought him mad. And so Ian Bridges farmed as best he could, applied the minimum fertilizer he could afford, watched his yields decline by a percentage point or two each year, and wrote it all down in his quiet, careful hand. He died in January of 2003 during a cold snap that froze the pipes in the farmhouse and turned the windows to sheets of white. Tessa drove up from Regina, where she had been working as a lab technician at the university, for the funeral. She never drove back. Let me tell you what she did, because it was the kind of decision that looks either brave or insane, depending on which side of the outcome you're standing on. She spent the first 2 weeks after the funeral reading her father's notebooks from cover to cover. All 14 of them. She spread the aerial photographs across the kitchen table and overlaid them with his hand-drawn maps of the old slough system. She cross-referenced his rainfall data with his yield records, and a pattern emerged, as clear and undeniable as a crack in a window. The years when a few of the low spots on the farm held water naturally, even briefly, the yields in the surrounding fields were measurably better. Not by a lot, a bushel or two per acre, but consistently. Her father had seen it. He'd underlined the numbers. He just hadn't been able to act on it. Tessa could. She had nothing left to lose. The farm was mortgaged. The equipment was old. The next crop, if it failed, would be the last. She took the small life insurance payout from her father's policy, $12,000, and she did not use it to buy seed or fertilizer or pay down the debt, which is what any sensible person would have done. She drove to the municipal office in Bengo and filed for a permit to block 3 drainage culverts on her own property. She wanted to re-flood the old sloughs. The clerk, a kind woman who had known Tessa's father, looked at the application with confusion. "You want to plug your own drainage?" she asked, as if Tessa had requested permission to set her own house on fire. "Yes, ma'am." "You know your grandfather put those in." "I do." The clerk stamped the papers with the expression of someone who had decided it was not her job to save people from themselves. Then Tessa hired a man with a small excavator, the cheapest she could find, and over the course of a single long week in April, they blocked the culverts and reshaped 3 low areas on the farm back into shallow basins, following the contours her father had traced on his maps. She seeded the margins with native sedge, willow, and cattail plugs she had gathered from the Crown Land sloughs to the east, stuffing them into the mud with her bare hands, her knees sinking into the cold prairie muck. When the spring melt came, and the snow melt had nowhere to go but into those newly sealed basins, water pooled for the first time in nearly 40 years. 3 silver mirrors appeared in the middle of what had been, for decades, a flat beige expanse of struggling cropland. Tessa had given back to the land what her grandfather had taken from it. Her nearest neighbor, a man named Mr. Mackey, whose own 1,200 acres ran right up against her eastern fence line, was the first to notice. He was a large, weathered man who farmed with the grim efficiency of a soldier, and who believed with the unshakable faith of a prairie conservative that more land meant more crop, and more crop was the only math that mattered. He drove his truck along the grid road, slowed, and stared at the water, shimmering where dry wheat stubble should have been. He stopped at her lane the next day. "Tessa," he said, standing by his truck, his cap pushed back on his head. "I don't want to stick my nose where it doesn't belong, but did you flood your own quarter?" 3 sloughs, she said. "I'm restoring them, restoring them. He repeated the words as if she'd spoken a foreign language. Girl, your grandfather spent 2 summers draining those. Your dad worked that ground his whole life. And the ground quit on him, Mr. Mackey. You saw it. He looked at her for a long time, then looked out at the water, his jaw working slowly, the way it did when he was chewing over something he didn't like the taste of. Your call? He said finally, and drove away. By the time the coffee shop in town had the story, which took approximately 36 hours, Tessa Bridges was unanimous. Same thing that happened to her dad. Same thing that happened to her dad. The Bridges family just didn't have the constitution for farming. She was flooding good cropland, giving up productive acres, all because of some romantic notion about slows. It was a tragedy, really. A young woman throwing away her last chance. The word reached Mr. Fenton by the end of the month. Mr. Fenton was the regional agronomist for the Provincial Agriculture Ministry, a man with a master's degree in soil science and an unshakable belief that every problem in agriculture could be solved with the right input, applied at the right rate, at the right time. He was a decent man in his way, but he had the particular blindness of the highly educated, a tendency to trust his models more than his eyes. He called Tessa and asked if he could visit. She said yes. He arrived in a clean government truck, wearing clean boots that had never seen the inside of a barn, carrying a binder thick with soil maps and yield projections. He walked the edges of the newly flooded sloughs with her, frowning at the water, the mud, the scraggly cattail plugs she had jammed into the banks. Miss Bridges, he began, and his tone had that particular quality of professional gentleness that people use when they're about to tell you something they think you're too foolish to understand. I appreciate what you're trying to do here. I really do. Your father was a thoughtful man. But you need to understand the economics of this. You've taken roughly 60 acres out of production. At current canola prices, that's nearly $30,000 in lost revenue per year. In 3 years, that's the cost of a new combine header. In 5 years, that's a down payment on land. The acres I took out were yielding 12 bushels of wheat, Mr. Fenton, Tessa said, on a good year, which is exactly why you need a proper soil amendment program. I can put together a plan. Gypsum for the salinity, anhydrous for the nitrogen, a targeted herbicide rotation. We can get those fields back to 30 bushels within 2 seasons. And what will the soil look like in 10 years? He paused, his pen hovering over his clipboard. That's a long-term question, Miss Bridges. We deal with the short-term first. My father dealt with the short-term his whole life, Tessa said, and it killed him. Mr. Fenton closed his binder with a snap that was louder than he intended. He was not accustomed to being argued with by young women who didn't have degrees. He thanked her for her time and drove away. 3 weeks later, at a regional agriculture conference in Swift Current, he used satellite images of Tessa's flooded fields as an example of what he called well-intentioned but economically irrational land management. The room, full of men who understood the value of every acre down to the last square foot, shook their heads in collective disapproval. The Bridges girl was mentioned with the same mix of pity and amusement people reserved for eccentrics and drunks. Tessa was not there to hear it. She was at home, kneeling in the mud beside the largest of her 3 new sloughs, watching a pair of pintail ducks settle onto the water. They were the first ducks she had seen on the farm in her entire life. The next visitor came in July, when the canola was in bloom and the air was sweet and yellow. His name was Mr. Stratton, and he was a territory manager for one of the largest agricultural chemical companies in Western Canada. He drove a truck so new and clean, it looked like a showroom display, and he wore a fleece vest with the company logo embroidered over his heart like a badge of office. He was younger than Mr. Fenton, smoother, and far more dangerous. because where Mr. Fenton had offered expertise, Mr. Stratton offered money. "Tessa," he said, using her first name immediately, as salesmen do, to manufacture intimacy, "I heard about your situation. Losing your dad, taking over the farm on your own. I think what you're doing takes real guts." He leaned against the fender of his truck, arms crossed, projecting an air of casual admiration. "But I also know you're carrying debt, and those new, ponds aren't going to pay the bills this fall. So here's what I'm thinking. We put you on a full crop protection and fertility program, top to bottom. Seed treatment, pre-emergent herbicide, in-crop fungicide, and a custom nitrogen blend. I can defer the entire bill until after harvest. Zero down, zero interest until December. You'll see the difference in the first season, I guarantee it." He was offering her a lifeline, a way back to normality. All it would cost was the water in those sloughs and the quiet voice of her father in her head. "Mr. Stratton," Tessa said, "my father wrote something in one of his notebooks that I keep coming back to. He said the land doesn't need another prescription. It needs to remember what it was." Stratton's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes cooled. "That's poetic," he said, "but poetry doesn't pay the bank. Neither does a chemical program I can't afford to repeat next year. Tessa," his voice dropped, confidential, as if he were sharing a secret. "I've seen 100 farms like this. The ones that make it are the ones that invest. The ones that gamble on ponds and ducks." He let the sentence trail off, the implication hanging in the air like a blade. "I appreciate you coming out," she said. He looked at her, reassessed, and for the first time his professional warmth slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "Suit yourself," he said. "But when the bank calls, they won't care about your father's notebooks." He drove away, and the dust from his tires settled on the cattails at the edge of the nearest slough. "Now let me stop here and ask you something. Have you ever made a choice that every reasonable person around you said was wrong? Not a small choice, not what to have for dinner or which road to take home, but a choice that bet your entire future on an idea so quiet, so unproven, that even you weren't sure it would work. And the silence in the house seems to agree with everyone else. You're wrong. You've made a terrible mistake, and the only voice that says otherwise belongs to a dead man whose words live only in faded ink on lined paper." That was where Tessa Bridges stood in the summer of 2003. 3 ponds in a dead field and a whole community waiting for her to fail. Let me tell you about the science, because the science is what makes this story more than just sentiment. What Tessa's father had intuited, and what Tessa was now testing with her own land and her own future, was something that agricultural researchers would spend the next 2 decades confirming. The prairie sloughs were not wasted land. They were, in fact, the immune system of the entire landscape. A healthy slough does several things simultaneously. First, it acts as a giant sponge. Spring meltwater and summer rain collect in the basin and soak slowly into the surrounding soil, recharging the shallow groundwater that crop roots depend on. Without the slough, that water runs off the surface, carrying topsoil with it, and the water table drops. Second, the slough acts as a salt trap. The salinization that was killing farms across southern Saskatchewan happened because the water table, deprived of its natural recharge points, shifted. Salts that had been locked deep underground were drawn to the surface by capillary action, like a wick drawing oil up a lamp. A functioning slough stabilizes the water table, keeping the salt where it belongs, underground. Third, and this is what Tessa's father had been watching all those years, the margins of a healthy slough are an explosion of biological activity. The decaying cattails, the algae, the invertebrate water droppings, all of it feeds a community of soil microbes that radiate outward from the slough edge into the surrounding field. The soil within 100 meters of a living slough is measurably richer in organic matter, nitrogen, and phosphorus than the soil in the middle of a drained, cropped quarter. The slough feeds the field. It always had. And when the farmers drained the sloughs, they didn't just remove the water. They removed the engine that had been building the prairie's fertility for 10,000 years. Tessa knew some of this from her father's notebooks. She knew some of it from her own training in biology at the university. And she knew some of it in her bones, from years of walking this land with a man who saw things that other men walked right past. The first year was brutal. The flooded areas attracted mosquitoes, and Mr. Mackey, whose cattle pastured on the next quarter, made a pointed comment about the new bug factory on the Bridges place. The cattails grew slowly, thin and tentative, like children in a new school. The wheat in the remaining fields yielded poorly, no worse than before, but no better, and the empty acres where the sloughs now sat were a daily, visible reminder of the gamble she had taken. The debt grew. The banks sent letters. Tessa took a part-time job doing bookkeeping for the municipal office to keep the payments current. She had a moment of crisis in the second winter. It was February, 40 below, and the furnace in the farmhouse failed at 2 in the morning. She lay in bed under every blanket she owned, watching her breath crystallize in the beam of her flashlight, and she thought very clearly, I could sell. She could sell the land to Mr. Mackey, who had made a quiet offer through a mutual acquaintance. She could pay off the debt, move back to Regina, get her old lab job back. She could have heat and a salary and the ordinary, bearable disappointments of a normal life. She would not have to kneel in freezing mud anymore, planting cattails that might or might not survive. She would not have to endure the careful, pitying smiles of people in town who had already decided she was finished. She got up, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and walked to the kitchen. She lit the gas stove for warmth and opened the box of her father's notebooks. She found the page she was looking for, the one with the aerial photograph of the old slough system. He had drawn each slough as a small circle, and from each circle he had drawn lines radiating outward like a child's drawing of Sneen, a shine of the Sneen. Beside it, he had written, "These are the hearts of the land. When we stop them, the land stopped too." She closed the notebook, turned off the stove, and went back to bed. In the morning, she called a repairman for the furnace and drove to town to file her crop insurance papers for the coming season. She was not going to sell. The second spring, she noticed the first changes. The cattails around the largest slough had thickened into a dense, rustling wall. Red-winged blackbirds appeared, dozens of them, clinging to the cattail stems and filling the air with their liquid, territorial calls. The soil at the margins of the sloughs, which had been white with salt crust the previous year, was darkening. It was subtle, no more than a shade or two, but Tessa saw it. She crumbled a handful between her fingers. It held together differently. There was a texture to it, a slight greasiness that hadn't been there before. The microbes were waking up. By the third year, the difference was impossible to ignore. The wheat in the fields adjacent to the restored sloughs was 6 inches taller than the wheat in the far fields. It was a deeper green. The heads were heavier. When she combined that fall, the monitor on the old case IH told the story in numbers. 28 bushels per acre next to the sloughs, 19 bushels in the far fields. The county average was 24. She took soil samples from both areas and sent them to the provincial lab in Saskatoon. The results came back in a brown envelope that she opened at the kitchen table with hands that shook slightly. The soil adjacent to the sloughs had an organic matter content of 4.2%. The far fields were at 1.8%. The slough-side soil had twice the microbial biomass, 3 times the available phosphorus, and significantly lower salinity. In 3 years, the sloughs had begun to undo 40 years of damage. She pinned the lab report to the wall above her father's desk, next to the aerial photograph with his hand-drawn circles. Then she sat down and cried, not from sadness but from a relief so deep it felt like a physical unburdening, as if she had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had finally been allowed to set it down. The 4th and 5th years were the quiet crescendo. Tessa expanded. She blocked 2 more culverts and restored 2 more sloughs. Using the same method, the same native plants, each new slough sent its invisible roots of fertility outward into the surrounding fields. Her yields climbed steadily, 28 bushels, 31, 34. The county average stayed flat at 23 or 24, held hostage by rising input costs and declining soil health. The other farmers poured on more nitrogen to compensate for what the soil could no longer provide, and each year it cost more to get less. Tessa's input costs, meanwhile, were almost nothing. She bought seed, that was it. No nitrogen, no fungicide, no herbicide. The healthy soil, fed by the sloughs, grew a crop that was vigorous enough to outcompete the weeds and resist the diseases that plagued her neighbors' chemically dependent fields. The drought of 2008 was the proof that no one could argue with. Southern Saskatchewan baked under the worst dry spell in 20 years. The fields around Bengal turned yellow in July and brown by August. Crops withered. Combines sat idle. Grown men stood at the edges of their fields and did not speak because there was nothing to say. The drained, compacted, salt-poisoned soil could not hold moisture. When rain did fall, it sheeted off the surface and ran into the ditches, carrying what little topsoil remained. But Tessa's sloughs had been collecting water for 5 years. They were reservoirs, small but deep enough to sustain the groundwater around them through the dry months. The soil near the sloughs, rich with organic matter, held moisture the way a healthy sponge holds water. It didn't sheet off, it soaked in. Her wheat stood green and upright in August, while the fields on every side of her were the color of cardboard. Her yield that fall was 31 bushels per acre. The county average was 9. The numbers were posted at the elevator, and for the first time in the history of the Bengo coffee shop, nobody laughed at the Bridges girl. Mr. Mackey appeared at her door on a Saturday morning in October of that year. He stood on the porch with his cap in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim, a gesture so unlike the blunt, confident man she knew that Tessa almost didn't recognize him. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I've been farming next to you for 6 years, and I've been wrong about you for every one of them." Tessa opened the screen door. "Come in, Mr. Mackey. I'll put on coffee." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Tessa's father had written his notebooks, and Mackey looked out the window at the sloughs glinting silver in the autumn sun. "My east quarter is gone," he said flatly. "The salt's up to the surface now. I can't grow a weed on it, let alone a crop. I've been pouring chemicals on that ground for 30 years, and it just keeps getting worse." He paused. "How did you know? How did you know the water would fix it?" "I didn't," Tessa said. "My father knew. He just never got the chance." It was 6 years after the drought, a full decade since Tessa had blocked her first culvert, that Mr. Stratton's truck appeared on her grid road again. It was a newer truck now, but the man behind the wheel looked older. The chemical company he worked for had been bought by a larger one, and the larger one was under pressure. Farmers were asking questions they hadn't asked before. The soil was getting worse, not better. The inputs were getting more expensive. Resistance was building in the weeds and the fungi. The old model, the one that treated the soil as a chemistry set, and the farm as a factory was cracking at the seams, and men like Stratton were scrambling for a new story to sell. He found Tessa in the machine shed, replacing a belt on the swather. She looked up when he walked in, her hands dark with grease, and she recognized him immediately. "Mr. Stratton," she said. He had the look of a man who had rehearsed a speech. "Miss Bridges, Tessa, I won't take much of your time. I just wanted to say that I was here 10 years ago, and I was wrong. What you've done with this land, the yields you're getting, it's the best in the district, and everyone knows it. My company is starting a new division, Regenerative Agriculture Solutions. We want to partner with producers who are doing what you're doing. We could package your system, the slough restoration, the native plantings, the whole approach. Create a program that other farmers could buy into. Consulting fees, licensing, the whole thing. You'd be the face of it. You'd make real money, Tessa. And you'd help a lot of people." Tessa wiped her hands on a rag and looked at him with an expression that was not anger, not contempt, but something closer to patience. "Mr. Stratton," she said, "you came here 10 years ago and told me that poetry doesn't pay the bank. Do you remember that?" He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I do. You were wrong, but not in the way you think. This isn't a system you can put in a box and sell. Every piece of land is different. Every slough is different. The reason this works is because I spent years listening to this specific piece of ground, reading my father's notes about this specific piece of ground, and making decisions that fit this place and no other. The minute you turn it into a product, you'll do exactly what your industry has always done. You'll take something alive and make it into something dead. You'll standardize it. You'll sell it at a margin. And it will fail, because the whole point is that it can't be standardized. It has to be learned." Stratton stood there for a moment, processing. He was a smart man, smart enough to recognize when he was out of his depth. "So, what do you suggest?" he asked, and for the first time his voice had no angle to it. He was simply asking. "Tell your farmers to go home and look at their land," Tessa said. "Really look at it. Find the old slough beds. Find the low spots. Read the history of their own ground. The answers are already there. They always were. They just got drained away." He left without making a sale, but he left thinking. That was more than Tessa expected. Now let me carry this story forward, because the real measure of what Tessa Bridges did is not in a single harvest or a single decade. It is in the long arc of what happened to the land and to the community around it. In 2012, when grain prices crashed and the debt cycle tightened like a belt around the waist of every farm in the district, Tessa was carrying no debt at all. She had paid off the farm credit loan in 2009, 5 years ahead of schedule, using nothing but crop revenue from fields that received no purchased inputs. When Mr. Mackey's son, unable to service the loans his father had taken on, put the East Quarter up for sale, Tessa bought it. She paid a fair price. She blocked the culverts. She planted cattails. She began the slow, patient work of bringing another piece of dead ground back to life. Over the next 15 years, she did the same with 3 more parcels, each one purchased from a neighbor who could no longer afford the chemical treadmill. Her farm grew from 800 acres to just under 3,000. It became a patchwork of sloughs and fields, water and wheat, each slough feeding the soil around it in the way that her father had always believed was possible. From the air, her land looked different from everything around it. Where the neighboring farms were uniform beige rectangles, Tessa's was a mosaic of silver water, dark soil, and green crop, interrupted by the wild tangle of cattail and willow at the slough margins. It looked, from above, like what the prairie had looked like before anyone had ever put a plow to it. It looked alive. Ducks Unlimited, the conservation organization, came to study her sloughs in 2015 and found that her 5 restored wetlands supported over 40 species of waterfowl and shorebirds, including several that were listed as species at risk. The University of Saskatchewan sent a graduate student who spent 2 seasons sampling her soil and wrote a thesis that was cited in 14 subsequent papers. Mr. Fenton, the provincial agronomist, now retired, read one of those papers and sent Tessa a handwritten note. It said, simply, "Your father was right. I'm sorry I didn't see it." She kept the note in the box with the notebooks. If you were to visit the farm today, you would find a woman in her late 40s, lean and weathered, and entirely at ease in her own skin, walking the margins of a slough with a girl of about 9. The girl is her daughter, and she has her mother's steady gaze and her grandfather's habit of kneeling down to touch the soil. Tessa doesn't lecture her. She shows her. She has her crumble the dark earth between her fingers. She has her watch the pintails glide across the water. She teaches her to see. In the farmhouse, on the desk in the room that was once her father's and is now hers, 2 boxes sit side by side. One contains 14 notebooks in a hand she recognizes like a face. The other, taller, contains 22 notebooks in her own hand. 2 decades of data, observation, rainfall, yield, and the slow, meticulous record of a landscape returning to health. One day, she will give both boxes to her daughter, and with them, the quiet understanding that is passed now through 3 generations of hands that knew this land, that the answers to the hardest questions are rarely found in a bag or a bottle or a salesman's promise. They are found in the water, in the soil, and in the patient, unshakable act of listening to the ground beneath your feet and giving back what was taken away. The men with the degrees and the company trucks looked at the prairie and saw a production problem. They saw inputs and outputs, acres and bushels, a spreadsheet to be optimized with the right chemical formula. They told her to drain more, spray more, spend more. Tessa, guided by the memory of a quiet man who drew little suns around the sloughs on an old photograph, looked at the same prairie and saw a living thing that had been wounded. She understood that the cure was not another product to be purchased, but a process to be restored. They all laughed when she flooded her own fields. But they never understood the real lesson. The water was just the beginning. The real miracle was in the patience, in the observation, and in the stubborn, bone-deep conviction that if you give the land back what it lost, the land will remember and it will give you everything in return.